I'm back with Duncan to keep talking about the opening scene in Genesis. We've been saying Genesis 1 a lot. Actually, we're looking at the start of Genesis 2, but it flows on from Genesis 1. What we're going to talk about today is the Sabbath. The Sabbath in the beginning of the Bible, and then tracing that theme through the Bible. Mm-hmm. So, Duncan, what can you tell us about Sabbath in Genesis?
Well, if you look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, then you can see different ways that the author has put that section of the Bible together. So there's one way where it's focusing on God bringing order to the world on days 1 to 3, which is your royal function, creating a space that will sustain life as God intended it to be lived. And then the priestly function in days 4 to 6, where he's filling that order with life. And then day 7 is the Sabbath. So that way of, you can look at the patterns that exist there, and that emphasizes those two themes. But when we think about the seventh day, there's actually a second design pattern to these verses that's not focused on so much what God is doing through his creation, but is focused more on the rhythm and patterns that sustain and nurture human life. So in that pattern, on day 1, God creates the light and the darkness. And so that creates your daily rhythms. And along with that would go the daily recitation of the Shema, and the daily sacrifice at the temple. And then on day 4, you get the sun and the moon, or the author doesn't call them the sun and the moon, he calls them the great lights. And they then set up your annual rhythms. So you've got your cycle of festivals and ultimately the Day of Atonement being the really crucial one. And then on the 7th day, you get this teaching about the Sabbath. And so that sets up your weekly rhythms of Sabbath. But also every 7th year becomes a Sabbath year where the land is allowed to rest from productivity. And every 7th Sabbath year, you have a year of Jubilee, which is a time when all the debts are cancelled and slaves are set free and land is returned to its original owners. So on days 1 and 4 and 7, you have this establishment of patterns and rhythms that will support and underpin life. And that ultimately leads us to the 7th day and creates a pattern of worship. It teaches us how we're supposed to interact with our Creator.
Okay, so we have daily rhythms, weekly rhythms, and annual rhythms. Mm-hmm. And the Sabbath is given a weekly rhythm for us to follow and engage with God, mm-hmm. with a weekly rhythm of worship.
Yeah, and it's really interesting with the 7th day, the way it appears in that structure. So in Genesis 1 and 2, it talks about, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so you have the beginning of the process. And at the end of day 6, in 2 verse 1, it says, so God finished his work of creating. And then you get day 7. So that's like, well, I thought it was supposed to be everything created in a week, but it's all done on days 1 to 6. So in the very design of the text is really screaming at us, this day is separate, this day is different, this day is set apart from the previous 6 days.
And it's different because on the previous 6 days there's work, and on the 7th day there's rest.
Yeah, so it's almost like the first 6 days are setting us up for the 7th day. The 7th day is where it's all been headed. So often, I think in our contemporary world, we think the real business is what we do on the weekdays, and then the weekend is just a chance to rest and get our breath back. So the weekend becomes a therapeutic respite from the real business that goes on during the week. But actually, Genesis 1 has a completely different way of looking at it. Days 1 to 6 set everything up, and day 7 it's there to enjoy it.
So the work that God is doing is a means to an end, and the end is the rest.
Absolutely. And so the Sabbath then becomes enshrined in Israel's basic codes of how to live. And if you look at the 10 Commandments, they speak about how the Sabbath is to be practiced. And so in Exodus, it talks about Shabbat, the idea of stopping work. And that, I think, is the meaning that we're more familiar with. If you come on to Deuteronomy, it talks about resting from your work. And that word rest is a different word from the word for stopping. And it's a very interesting word. It has a big field of meaning. But one of the meanings is to take up residence. So if you think about the locusts when they came into Egypt during the plagues in the Exodus, and it said the locusts rested in the land. They took up residence. It's the same word or root word as when God rested Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, when he placed them in the Garden of Eden. So it's kind of the idea that, as I think we said in an earlier video, the creation becomes God's temple. It becomes the place where he wants to live with humanity. And this rest word speaks of the Creator coming and taking up residence in his creation. So if you have a look at the story of the tabernacle, which of course is a little mini Eden, it says Moses finished the work and then God came by his Spirit and took up residence in the creation. And if you look at the tabernacle, the temple rather, when Solomon finished building his temple, it says he finished the work and God came and filled the temple with his presence and with his glory. And so it's this pattern that days 1 to 6 is building the temple, but the seventh day, the Sabbath day, is when God moves in to take up residence in his creation and to come and be with his representative rulers, us.
So when we say work is the means to the end and the end is rest, it's not just relaxing, but it's the presence of God filling all things, and us having the fullness of life because we can enter his presence and enjoy his company. I was also thinking about how, I said work is the means to the end, and that's rest with God. But the work that's done in Genesis is all God working. And humanity doesn't do any work. Humanity is just created to enjoy rest with God.
Yeah. And it talks about resting, and of course God works, but God rests. So if we think about Sabbath, we can't imagine that God is resting because he's burnt himself out or because he's fried or exhausted. That can't be what rest means, because that's not who God is. So that then challenges the way that we often think about Sabbath, which is kind of a therapeutic response to the pressures and demands of modern life.
Like a day off.
Yeah, God's gift to Israel's gift to the world of a weekend. No, it's got to be more than that. So if we put these two ideas of rest together, rest as stopping work and rest as God being enthroned and taking up residence, then we have a rather richer picture of what Sabbath means, that we are entering into God's rest, that we are almost prophetically laying down, I need to be productive and to secure our identity and our well-being, and recognizing that actually everything that we have is derivative from God, the God who is in our midst, on whom our life depends, who provides for us. Our rule makes sense within his rule. Our identity is derivative from his identity. So Sabbath becomes not so much about getting your breath back, but it comes more to do with stopping all of this perpetual temptation to take our identity and our security from what we do, and recognize the God who loves us and God who provides everything that we need is dwelling in our midst and is enthroned in his creation.
And invites us to experience his company in his life.
Absolutely. And so when you read in Genesis 2, it talks about the Sabbath being blessed and the Sabbath being hallowed or set apart. It's quite an odd concept, isn't it? Kind of a period of time is blessed and a period of time is set apart. But I guess it means getting free from all the distractions of what we do and getting back to the source who is God. And that is the blessing. So if we will stop, if we will obey the Sabbath, and disengage from all of the relentless demands of productivity and achievement and focus, and give our attention back to the one who gives us everything else, then that will transform us, that will make us more set apart for God, and it will bless us. It will help us receive all that we need in the way that God intended us to receive it in the first place.
Yeah. So how do we enter the rest and the Sabbath that God offers us if it's not just, well, part of it is stopping work, but it's more than not working. It's something else. It's an encounter with God.
Absolutely.
How do we do that apart from just not work?
Well, if we come to Hebrews 4 talks about entering God's rest. And it talks about how in the Old Testament, the Exodus never actually delivered rest to God's people. There was this idea of rest. They were heading to rest in the Promised Land, but they weren't able to enter in. And if you think about the story in the Hebrew Scriptures, they did get into the Promised Land and they were very careful about practicing the Sabbath. And yet that wasn't somehow the reality that they were after. There was something else beyond just the day of the Sabbath and something else beyond the Promised Land. And ultimately, of course, that's the new creation. And the thing that kept them out of the new creation was unbelief. They did not trust God. So if we won't trust God with our identity and our security and our well-being and our provision, then we won't be able to stop work because it will all depend on us. And we'll be perpetually driven, which creates precisely the sort of culture we have at the moment. But if we will trust, and that is the crucial thing, and stopping then becomes a prophetic sign that we are not trusting in ourselves, but we are looking to our Creator who is with us and in our midst. Yeah, so I would see trust as the key.
So practicing Sabbath and stopping work as a weekly rhythm is supposed to be an act of faith in a God who's able to provide everything we really need.
Absolutely.
And trusting the one who can accomplish the creation that facilitates the rest, or the new creation that facilitates the rest.
Absolutely. So if you think of the Hebrews in the wilderness, God provided miraculously bread for them in the wilderness, and every day they had to go and gather it. But on the day before the Sabbath, they had to gather double so that they wouldn't have to gather on the Sabbath. And those who gathered too much didn't have too much, and those who gathered too little didn't have too little. But those who tried to cheat and hoard found it all just went mouldy. And again, it's this idea back to Genesis 1 again, that God has ordered the world and he has filled it with life. And so Sabbath becomes a way of submitting to God's order for the world and trusting in his provision. And in so doing, we find it refreshes and renews and restores our life.
Yeah. Hebrews 4, it talks about entering rest through faith. It goes on to say that we have a high priest who's a forerunner. He's gone before us and he is sympathetic to us and compassionate, so we can approach the throne of grace for grace and mercy in our time of need. So stopping work and entering rest to enjoy God's presence is an act of faith in Jesus. Believing Jesus has made it possible for me to approach God, because I couldn't approach him before. You can't just walk through the curtain into the most holy place, can you? Only the high priest can do that. And there's all of these sacrifices that have to be made. But we do. Hebrews talks about we have this anchor for our soul beyond the curtain because Jesus has gone beyond and represents us there, so we can follow him into the most holy place. And that's essentially what Sabbath is, isn't it? It's the holy place is like the special location where God is dwelling. And then the Sabbath is like the equivalent of that for time. It's a special time set apart for God's presence to be encountered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we can enter into that special time, drawing close to God, because Jesus has made that possible.
Mm-hmm.
He's cleansed us from sin and he's made us holy. So we can confidently approach God.
Absolutely.
And taste that rest.
And Hebrews 1, of course, makes it clear that Jesus, the Son, was the active agent in creation in the first place. So the one who did all the work and was resting was in fact Jesus. And so Sabbath becomes a way of honouring King Jesus' order that he has built into creation and trusting King Jesus and Jesus the high priest, who can transform and renew our life, as he was the one who made it in the first place.
Yeah, he's the one who ordered the world and he's the one who filled it with life.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the one also who can save what he created.
Absolutely.
And recreate it.
Mm-hmm.
He can recreate our hearts, take the heart of stone away, and put heart of flesh that loves the Lord and his law.
I mean, I think it was Pascal who said, most of man's troubles stem from the fact that he cannot sit quietly in his room. And that testifies to our struggle to trust in God's order and in trust in God's provision of life. On the other hand, Sabbath is building our capacity to trust God loves us, that he's got us, that he is ordering life in a way that sustains life, and he can transform us and lead us into life in all its fullness.
Yeah, I like that idea that it's an opportunity to practice faith, to put aside the other things we might trust in and just enjoy God and know I don't need to do anything. I'm loved. I'm cleansed by Jesus. And because of him, I can approach.
Yeah. Because ultimately, actually, the Sabbath is a very effective antidote to the pressures of modern life. Because the problem is not that modern life is busy. The problem is that modern life is busy because we do not trust God to order our life, and we do not trust God to give us what we need. And so we experience this relentless pressure to prove ourselves and sustain ourselves. But if we can practice Sabbath, we actually learn to say, no, my life is secure and it's a gift from God, and his order, not the order of the world, is what will actually bring me security and peace and fullness.
Yeah. John Bunyan says something interesting about the Sabbath. He talks about the Sabbath being a day that tells you more about yourself than any other day. So, Monday through Saturday in Bunyan's time and place, people are working. And so they have responsibilities to fulfill. They don't have a lot of spare time to put aside. They're working, they have family responsibilities, and so on. And then they have the Lord's Day, where they have freedom to spend their time as they choose. And they have the freedom to go to church and worship God and spend time in public worship and also spend time in private worship throughout that day with their family. And he says, this day tells you a lot about yourself, because on the other days, you don't have much choice about what you do. But on this day, you do have a choice. You have an opportunity to enjoy God, to have a foretaste of heaven, to have a foretaste of the new creation in which you're going to be enjoying God, knowing his goodness. And you can spend a day, foretasting that and looking forward to it. But many of us reach that day and there's something else that we'd rather do. There's some other thing that either we feel pressured to do, or that we actually, just being honest, something else that we would rather do than worship God. And Bunyan says, it shows you something about your heart, the state of your heart. And it's quite challenging, saying if there's something else you'd rather do, there's someone else you love more, there's something else you'd rather do, you should not just assume that your life has been changed by God. You should ask, why do I love something else more than God? Why am I making this decision? Why does my heart, prefer something other than the one who made me? Which is a big challenge, I think. But I think that Bunyan's onto something, that we can learn about ourselves by our approach to this opportunity we have, this weekly rhythm that we can enjoy. We can draw close to God.
Yeah.
When we're choosing something else, this really exposes an idol in our life that we need to be set free from.
Yeah, freedom exposes where our heart really is.
Yeah, what we really love. And what we really are putting our trust in.
That is quite a serious challenge.
Yeah, it is a serious challenge. So Sabbath is a serious challenge, but it's also an incredible gift from God.